Any questions, and I don't know what the format is, since I just came through the side door and jumped on it. Yes, sir.
Marlin, this may be a unpleasant question for the group here, but in my opinion, part of the problem in Washington is that our Republican elected officials in Washington as a whole, in my opinion, are not acting like Republicans. They've been very liberal as a whole, and if Republicans in the last decade plus at the Washington acting as Republicans, the core values, this country would be in the midst of this right now. We're not standing up to the process out there that we should, like we have in Indiana and Allen County, being very conservative. Indiana, one of the best countries in the state, being fiscal right now on issues because of how we spend our money. So, if you are elected as a senator, how are you going to address the how do I word with you here? The problem in Washington with our elected officials not really standing up to their Republican morals?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that, I mean, it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take the right kind of people to get elected to Washington. I mean, you know, here in Indiana, we're fortunate enough to have solid conservatives in the legislature. Even though we have a slim minority in the House, we have a strong majority in the Senate, and we have a governor who's willing to lead. We need the same thing, same type of leadership in Washington. And, you know, as long as President Obama is in office, I don't think we're going to see, any major reform in shrinking the size of government. But over the last 30 years, under President Reagan, the deficit increased. It wasn't because of President Reagan. Well, he could have vetoed some of the bills, but it was because of a Democrat Congress. Under President Bush, deficit spending, Democrat Congress. Under President Clinton, that's when there was a balanced budget, and it's because of a Republican Congress. And then they drifted away and started spending, and they passed No Child Left Behind, they passed Medicare Part D, and they passed some of these big social programs under Republican control, and that's when we lost the trust of the base of the party. And so I think, I hope that they've learned their lesson, anybody that's still there, and we need to elect new people who are willing to go to Washington and stick to their guns and realize that, the problem is a spending problem. We are believing, and people are starting to believe that, we have to pass a certain social program just to win the next election. I don't believe so. I believe if you let people have more money in their own pockets and you give them freedom and flexibility, they'll take care of their own problems. I mean, as President Reagan said, government's not the answer, government is the problem. And it's the same thing in healthcare, it's the same thing in housing, it's the same thing in our energy policy. Government continues to handcuff every one of those sectors, and if we would let the free market work, even in healthcare, I mean, what got us here to having one of the best healthcare systems in the world today is because of free market principles. And if we would get back to those principles, letting the markets work, because there are natural economic laws in a free market that will correct itself in supply and demand and other principles, we got to get away from the mindset that we have to spend money to win elections. Yes?
Recently, Senator DeMint introduced a thing on the earmarks for a year, and we only had about 25 or 30 U.S. Republicans voted against it too. On the earmarks, what do you think about that?
I've actually endorsed his plan to have a balanced budget amendment and to also have a one-year moratorium on earmarks. People say, well, earmarks is a small part of the budget. Well, it is, but you know what? You could look at everything. There's a small part everywhere that builds a big budget. And I think, for us, every one of us as Americans is going to have to step back and say, what can I do without? I mean, even as a farmer in agriculture, I think we need to phase out incrementally farm subsidies. It's a manipulation to the market. It's the same thing in earmarks. We can't, we've got the credit card maxed out, so we're going to go apply for another credit card to go buy a flat screen TV. I mean, we can't do it. We've got to stop spending and get the budget under control. Because the only thing we can do now, since we're pretty much borrowed to the max and nobody else wants to loan us money anymore, is to raise taxes on our own people. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
How do you feel about term limits?
I think 18 years is a good number of years. It'd be 3 terms for a U.S. Senator. I mean, if you can't get done in 18 years what you want to get done in Washington and let somebody else try, So I would support 18 years. I think if you get it too short, you start having lobbyists, staff, bureaucrats running the institution. And I think there's a reasonable amount of time, but even before term limits, I think that a part-time legislature serves Indiana very well. I think they should do less time. They should do less time in Washington and more time back home. I think that we should be changing some of the campaign finance rules so that there's more competitive races instead of, them stacking up their campaign war chest and having $13 million in the bank. I mean, let's start, leveling the playing field there. I think that that also we limit chairmanships and the length of time that people have on chairmanships. If we would never get to a vote on term limits, I think that there's other ways of limiting the amount of time. Because if there's a chairman that's been there for a long time and he loses his chairmanship, he's got to go sit at the the back of the room again or something. He's got to think twice about do I really want to be here? So I like him. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to do. So I think there's other things that we could work on before that. But if they did come up, I'd support something in a reasonable amount of time. All right. Well, I'll be around, and thanks again for having me. And I'll turn it back over to